Part 2, the warfare was long.
Brother Chairman, my dear brethren and sisters and our dear young people, we're going to continue looking at this prophecy of Daniel chapter 10 through to Daniel chapter 12. And remember, it is one prophecy. Just a couple of principles about Bible prophecy to background this particular section. With Bible prophecy, we must always keep in mind the big picture, how God sees things. We as humans tend to get carried away with everyday details, exciting things in the papers which we think may be indicative of Bible prophecy, and probably some of them are. But God always has a big picture in mind. He deals in terms of the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of men. The truth versus the apostate religion that has bedeviled the earth. Christ versus the man of sin. Zion versus Rome. And the key to all of God's dealings with mankind is the hope of Israel and the promises. The promises by which resurrection will take place and the saint community will come to its perfection that God has always intended for it. And as we noted in our first study, it's the existence, it's the development, it's the completion of the saint community that concerns God and why history takes the course that it does. God has detailed the times in the which He will purify, perfect and finish the saint community as the centrepiece of His kingdom. They will then bring in the rest of the world into that man of the one. And that's why the man of the one dominates this particular section of Daniel. There's a few keys to Daniel chapter 11 we need to get hold of. As we said, it's one continuous revelation from BC 536 to Armageddon. And so we have this course of human history being traced in this particular section of Daniel. Gabriel is condensing 2,500 years of human history, and it's mostly the history concerning the nation of Israel, but he's condensing that into what we would put down into perhaps 60 or 70 verses. And so he has to be brief, and particularly in Daniel chapter 12, he's exceptionally brief. He perceives by the start of Daniel chapter, or by the end of Daniel chapter 11 and into chapter 12, that Daniel is mentally exhausted. Having been taken through 200 or 300 years of history from his time, down through the times of the Greeks and the Greek invasions of the land of Israel and the time of the Antiochus and the Ptolemies, in great detail, we get to about verse 40. And the angel can see Daniel's eyes glazing over, and he then condenses the time of the end into about 6 verses. He then has the final part of the prophecy and the final vision, and that is not even explained to Daniel. He's told to seal up the book, it will be concealed until the time of the end. So we have this shortening that takes place of the last few years. What we do have in Daniel chapter 11 is the kings of the north and the south are different powers, different nations who occupy the territory around Israel. And that is the key to understanding Daniel chapter 11. Who is in occupation of the territory to the north and south of Israel? It will be different nations in different times of history. They will change as empires rise and fall and nations come and go. The important principle is who occupies the territory. This is a comment by Brother Thomas on Daniel chapter 2, which has the same principle applied to it. In speaking of these events of these latter days, the prophets refer not to races of men, but to the powers on the territories designated. The ancient nation symbolised in Daniel's image in chapter 2 no longer exists. Babylon is gone. Medo-Persia is gone. The ancient Greek empire is gone. The 2 legs of the Roman Empire have gone. But the image will stand up when all of those territories are once again encompassed by the Gog power at the time of the end. So you see, it's the territories upon which those powers rest that is the important thing to consider. It's the same with the kings of the north and the south. So in Daniel chapter 11, and just as our topic is the warfare was long, this talk is not going to be as long as the warfare. we're not going to attempt to cover Daniel chapter 11. I'm only going to cover verses 1 to 4 briefly, and then verse 36 to 39. In between, we have a huge section to do with the kings of the north and the south, particularly the Ptolemies and the people of Antiochus and their wars against each other, in which Israel got trampled in the middle. In verse 1 to 35, the history of Greece and the resistance of the Maccabees. That's what Daniel 11 is about. Verse 36 to 39, the rise of Rome as a power in the east and its religious character. We will look at that. In verse 40 to 45, the last king of the north, which is Russia, and his destruction outlined. And then in chapter 12, verses 1 to 4, the resurrection of the saints and the rescue of Israel. And those events are beautifully linked. Both of Daniel's people will be saved at the time of the end. But when we come to pick up from where we left off, we need to pick up these angels in Daniel chapter 10. Now I know we did the angels with you some years ago, but being humans, they say that everything I say, by the time you get home tonight, you will have forgotten 60% of it. By the end of the week, 90% of it. In 12 months' time, you'll say, who was that funny-looking chap that came last year? And that's the way we are. So I'm going to go over some of the things we learned about the angels. And we're just going to discuss the relationship between Michael and Gabriel. Now, the reason I want to do that is found in chapter 12, because, as we said, the river that Daniel saw the vision by, over which the man of the one stood, was the course of human history. That's why the river Hiddekel was chosen. It takes you back to the Garden of Eden. It starts, the river Hiddekel. And it flows on to the time of the end. And this winding, twisting course of human history is there because the man of the one needs it. The man of the one is being developed in that course of human history. The steering of the river. And as you know, rivers tend to run not in straight lines. They twist and they turn and they change direction. And that is steered by the two angels. And you see in chapter 12, verse 5, behold, there stood other two, the one on this side of the river and the one on that side of the river. So the river is being steered by these two mighty angels, taking directions from the man of the one. They're doing it because of the man of the one. And that's what the angels do. That's what the two mighty angels do. We're going to talk about these two mighty angels. Now, there are two angels in the Bible called angels of God's presence. These are the angels that guide, lead and direct the other angels. They give orders. They are very particular angels. One is Michael, the Yahweh angel. We know that because in Jude it talks about Michael the archangel, the chief angel. And you go back to the quote in Zechariah 3 where Jude is quoting from, and it says Yahweh said. So he's the Yahweh angel. He's a very special angel. He is the angel of God's presence. Gabriel also is an angel of God's presence. I am Gabriel that stands in the presence of God. And he came, of course, to announce the birth of Jesus Christ. So we have these two angels of God's presence. They are above all the other angels. And they share unique knowledge between themselves. And they cooperate beautifully. Now looking at Michael first. His name means he who is like God. And obviously it's a title name. What Michael's name was before he was immortalised, we don't know. We get indications of Revelation that we will have new names in the kingdom. Some of us might be very glad about that. I've never forgiven my parents. They called my brother James and my sister Elizabeth and me Ronald, and I can never work out why I got an unbiblical name. But we might get a new name in the kingdom. Michael is obviously a title that speaks of his work. He who is like unto God. And that's a very particular title because he had the remarkable privilege of representing God on the earth. His position, one of the chief princes, or the first princes, we're told in Daniel chapter 10 and verse 13, where Gabriel refers to him. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, or the first princes. And there's only two first princes we know amongst the angels. Called in Daniel 10 verse 21, Michael, your prince. And the reason that Gabriel calls him that is that one of the works of Michael is particularly concerning to guide the nation of Israel. Both Gabriel and Michael direct human history. Gabriel specialises in the things concerning the work of the Lord Jesus Christ, the saint community, and the revelation of God's will and God's understanding. Michael is very much in charge of the affairs of the nations and especially concerned with Israel. So we find that particular role that he has, Michael, your prince. And he was, of course, the one who was concerned with Israel. He was the one that led Israel through the wilderness. He was the Yahweh angel that Moses spake with face to face on Mount Sinai. He was the presence of God with Israel in the wilderness. Called in Joshua 5 verse 14, the captain or the prince of the host of Yahweh. And again, he's in charge of all the angels. He directs and sends forth the other angels. Called in Jude, the archangel, the chief angel. What's he doing? In Zechariah 3 that Jude quotes, he's saving Israel, contending with the adversary over the body of Moses. Those baptized into Moses were the Jews. And Michael is contending for them against the Satans. And it says in Exodus 23 that God's name is in him. Provoke him not, says God. My name is in him. He represents me. So Michael is the greatest of the angels. He is the leading angel. He is God's representative. I want to just re-quote some things I would have quoted to you before, just to show you that what I'm saying is not heresy. In Elpis Israel, which was the first book written by the Christadelphians, Brother Thomas clearly understood this Yahweh angel. It will be seen the everlasting God talks and acts or through these Elohim, but chiefly through one of them, the Yahweh Elohim. The serpent had seen the Yahweh Elohim and his companion Elohim. He had heard the Yahweh Elohim and the other Elohim conversing on the experience of good and evil. And when you go right through Elpis Israel, Brother Thomas just assumes that we understand that the Yahweh Elohim is there. And yet I would suggest that perhaps until 20 or 30 years ago, we didn't actually take much notice of Brother Thomas's clear understanding of that. Again, the pioneer understanding. 3 angels, this is the ones that came to Abraham, one of whom preeminently bore the name. Remember, it says Abraham stood yet before Yahweh. 2 men went down to Sodom, but Abraham stood yet before Yahweh. When Lot and his daughters were brought out of the city by the 2 angels that had spent the night with them, they brought them to the feet of the Yahweh angel. It says they brought Lot out, and he said. And again, the pronoun changes to indicate that the Yahweh angel is now again giving directions to the other 2. Brother Robert says, it will be seen, we've already quoted that one. Brother Thomas, it was therefore Azael, or as men say, God to Israel. He was not the only potentate who no man has seen nor can see, but his representative who was to be obeyed as to be worthy, eternal himself. So it doesn't matter where you go in the pioneer writings, the work of the Yahweh angel is clearly understood and perceived, and we need to be very confident with that interpretation. When we come to Gabriel, we have an angel that has a different role. Again, a name that indicates his title, the mighty God, the mighty power, known as also the Palmoni, the wonderful numberer. And that, of course, is found in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 13. And that's the other title that Gabriel has, because to Daniel and to the other angels, Gabriel was the one who was unfolding the time periods. When they wanted to understand a time period, they would go to Gabriel and say, well, how long is this period of downtreading you're talking about? And so they would go to him as the wonderful numberer. It's going to somebody it's like if you wanted to know what the state of the ecclesial finances were. You would go to the finance brother, wouldn't you? Because he's got the numbers. And we call him the finance brother because he knows where the money is, or he should. And you see, Gabriel was like that. He and Michael shared the calendar, and it was Gabriel that did the explaining. So if you wanted to find out about time periods, you asked Gabriel. And people perceived him as the bearer of the knowledge of the numbers, and the how long periods were Gabriel's responsibility. Key work was the work of the Messiah. He gave the 70 weeks prophecy to Daniel. He was there at the birth of the Lord Jesus Christ. He was there to tell Joseph what he should do. He was there to direct the wise men away from betraying the presence of Jesus. He was there to tell Joseph to go to Egypt. He told Joseph to come out of Egypt. He went to the shepherds of Bethlehem. Everywhere at the birth of Christ, Gabriel was there. We believe he was also there in the Garden of Gethsemane when an angel came to strengthen him. Exactly the words of Daniel chapter 10 and verse 20. There came like the appearance of a man and strengthened me. And Jesus likewise was on his face towards the ground, feeling totally weak and overwhelmed by the responsibility that lay ahead of him. And there, praying like Daniel, there came an angel to touch him and to strengthen him. and to reassure him of the resurrection. So his work was very much involved with Christ. But he also shared the divine timetable. Look at Daniel chapter 10 and verse 21. And this is Gabriel talking. But I will show thee. Now, you can quickly pick up it's Gabriel because it's exactly the same angel you find in chapter 8 and chapter 9 who shows Daniel the scriptures of truth. And he's referring to Michael. So the only two of them understand the calendar, and it's Gabriel that does the communicating. But I will show you that which is noted in the scripture of truth. And the scripture of truth here is the divine plan. They understand the course of history. They know where God's timetable is going. They know the time periods that nations will have in various locations. And there is none that holdeth with me in these things but Michael your prince. So the two of them share that divine timetable between them. When we come to the New Testament, Gabriel is also known there as the personal angel of the Lord Jesus Christ, his angel. Very great responsibility of these two angels. Now, let's just look at the work of Michael in particular. Michael speaks for God. When you go back in the Old Testament, you look wherever you have an angel speaking in the first person, it's Michael. He doesn't have to quote God. He comes along and he says, I have spoken, I will do it. I will spare the city, he said to Lot, for thy sake. He could make that decision on the spot. Other angels didn't have that authority. So Michael, when he appeared on the earth, spoke and acted and made decisions for God. He was God's representative on the earth. He commanded the angelic host. He prefigured the work of the Lord Jesus Christ, who would become God with us, who would become the great commander of the people and of the angelic host. Until Christ ascended to heaven, that role was performed by Michael. He managed the divine calendar with Gabriel, and he watched over Israel in particular. So we have these two mighty angels. Michael doing that work, Gabriel looking after the work of Christ, sharing the divine calendar and communicating to men. That's why in the book of Zechariah you will find the Yahweh angel and the angel that talked with me are in control of the events that take place and are dictated in the prophecy of Zechariah. And so we have the same in Revelation. You have the new Michael, the new commander, you have the Lord Jesus Christ in control of things, and you have Gabriel communicating to John. And the pattern is repeated over and over. So back in Daniel chapter 10, we have this tremendous angelic cooperation going on, but we see the angels have to work providentially behind the scenes. They can't just go along and say, look, time's come for the king of Persia to be actually attacking somebody else. Hit him with a bolt of lightning and he suddenly moves. They couldn't just do it. It had to be done providentially. So they had to cause events to take place in the courts of these kings that would lead them to take certain decisions of a political nature that they would move against other kings at the time that God had appointed. That meant they had to use their initiative. And as we find so often with angelic initiative, they were not always told what would be successful. Sometimes they tried things that didn't quite work. And we have that here in Daniel chapter 10 and verse 13. And here's the communicating angel working on the divine calendar with Michael. And he can see over there that Daniel has been praying for 3 weeks. And as we said, probably trying to work out when the decree of Cyrus will be given. And that's what I think he was praying about. And he'd been praying and mourning to understand the purpose of God and how it would be unfolded. For 3 weeks, he'd got thin and emaciated by not eating. And Gabriel was watching Daniel get weaker and weaker. But he's got a problem on his hands. The king of Persia is not doing what he should be doing. Now, we tend to think that angels are all powerful, and so they are. But when you have to work providentially, that takes some initiative and thinking, and it takes time. And so he says to Daniel, he says, look, at the end of verse 12, thy words were heard. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. That's why he had been praying for 21 days and nothing had happened. But he said, I'm here because Michael has helped me. Michael, the chief prince, came to help me. So in the end, Gabriel communicated with Michael, said, look, I need to get to Daniel. He can't last much longer. And Michael says, okay, I will take over with the king of Persia. You go and talk to Daniel. And that's just what he did. And so we see these angels at work. Gabriel being resisted by the king of Persia, Michael coming to assist, and the Hebrew there in verse 13 should actually read at the end where it says, I remain with the kings of Persia. It says, he remained. The Hebrew is actually, he remained with the kings of Persia. I mean, Gabriel wasn't telling you why he stayed there. He just says, I'm now here. I've actually come for your words. And Michael has remained with the king of Persia. Which of course were Darius and Cyrus, who were joint rulers at this stage. And now, having given the revelation to Daniel, he's about to leave Daniel and go back to manipulate the Persians. So he says in verse 20, Then said he, Knowest thou wherefore I come unto thee? So you got all that, Daniel? You understand all that? Because Daniel's head's spinning around like ours probably was. But he says, okay, you can see why I've come. Now I've got to go back and fight with the king of Persia. And when he's finished, when I finish with him, the prince of Grecia shall come. So he's already looking ahead, some 100 years to the next nation that will invade this territory. But he says, before I go, I'm going to show you the scriptures of truth. I'm going to outline what I have got in front of me. It's like he's got a map of the course of human history. Now, we do little charts of the 6,000-year plan or the 7,000-year plan of how human history has been performed. You imagine having the detailed sort of map that Gabriel and Michael have got. You can see the next 5 kings in Persia, and this one will be richer, and then all the intrigue of the north and south around Israel. And then the Maccabees, you can see the war of the Maccabees there. Then you can see Rome arriving. And then you can see right down through history the rise of the papacy and the persecutions that will take place. Right down to the time of the end when Russia comes into the land. He can see all of that. He's got it all outlined in front of him. He says, Daniel, okay, I'm now going to give you a history lesson of the future. I'm going to unfold 2,500 years for you. And then I'll go back and get on with the job with the Prince of Persia. And so we have these angels sharing this divine calendar. What I think is beautiful about this is the cooperation of the angels. Michael comes to help Gabriel because he's now got 2 parts of his job he's trying to perform at once. And the Prince of Persia is being difficult. But I want you to notice chapter 11 and verse 1. Forget the chapter division because it just completely spoils the thing. This is Gabriel talking to Daniel. Now, as I said, you think about it. Amongst the angels, where else on the earth was there a man that was so interested in divine affairs as Daniel? Who was so interested in what the angels were actually doing amongst the nations as Daniel? There was nobody to compare with this man. Oh man, greatly beloved. I know you're interested, he says to Daniel. Now, it's almost like he has a little bit of a boast to Daniel. None of that he's got pride, but he's actually rejoicing in the fact that what he's been given to do has come to pass. And this is a very intriguing thing about the angels. They do not know exactly what methods will come to pass, what will be successful. God never lets them fail to meet a deadline. But they have to work on it. They have to use their initiative. Remember the prophecy to Ahab? Micaiah says, I saw heaven opened and the angels of God. And God's saying, how are we going to get Ahab to go to battle? And one angel said this and one angel said that. Another one steps up and says, I've got an idea. God says, good on you. You got the right idea. Go and do it. And the angels have to use their initiative. And this is what these angels are doing. And they have been trying to get the Persian throne organised as God wants it organised. God had said, I want Cyrus on the throne. He will make the decree for the restoration of Jerusalem. But the Persians had mucked things around. Cyrus and Darius took Babylon together, and then Cyrus kept going on further campaigns to wipe out the rest of the Babylonian resistance. And Darius reigned for 2 years, and Daniel's sitting there saying, wrong man, wrong man. And then all of a sudden, Cyrus is sitting in the throne of Babylon. And Daniel starts praying. He says, at last we've got there. And the angel says, Daniel, and this is the literal Hebrew as on the screen. Also, I, Daniel, even I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, stood to confirm and to strengthen him. You know, the fact that Babylon fell so quickly in one night was my work. How do you think the gates were left open, Daniel, that let the troops get up the river into the city? That was my job. And you saw Darius come to power. It was what I did for Darius. And now I've got Cyrus there, Daniel. And you can see the confidence and the triumph that the angel is experiencing here. And what an insight into our role in the future. Just imagine for a moment if we are given the privilege of being in the kingdom of God and God says to you, well, I want you to go to Siberia and teach the people there about the things of God. People have lived under communism all their lives. And you get out there and they've got no idea what a Bible is, never heard of Jesus Christ, and you've got the job of bringing them to be part of the man of the one. That's going to need some initiative and some thinking, isn't it? And God's not going to say, well, if you do A, B and C, it will just happen. And that's what we're going to have to do as the angels of the age to come, is to move nations, to move people, to be what God wants them to be. And that's going to require initiative. And when we succeed, we will have the same sense of triumph and rejoicing that this angel was expressing to Daniel. And he had the truth. Look what he says in verse 21 of chapter 10. I will show you the scriptures of truth. And in chapter 11 verse 2, I will show you the truth. Now he wasn't just giving Daniel a doctrinal exposition. What he was saying was, what I am telling you here will absolutely, most certainly come to pass. As we said, that is the word about God's faithfulness. God is a God of truth. What he says will happen. That's why Daniel concluded it when he gave the summary at the start of chapter 10. The thing was true. It's absolutely faithful that's going to happen. So as I'll show you the truth. This is dead certain history, Daniel, you're going to get from here on. Well, what did he show Daniel? Well, he starts in chapter 11 and he says this. In chapter 11 verse 2 and 3. And now will I show you the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. Now bear in mind, we've gone through Darius and we've now got Cyrus. We're now going to have 3 more kings in Persia and then a 4th one who will be richer than the first and than all of them that have gone before. That's exactly what happened. We had Cambyses, Smerdis, and then Darius Hytaspes, who of course was the king we believe that married Esther. So that's the next 3, Cambyses, Smerdis and Darius Hytaspes. And then we have a king called the 4th, who is Xerxes. Now, he's very important because we're told what he would do. He would be richer than they all, and he was a fantastically wealthy king because of his conquests. By his strength through his riches, he shall stir up against the realm of the Grecians. And originally I was going to do a study on stirring up the Grecians, but we just couldn't fit it in, so we had to let that go. You know, that little phrase, stirring up the Grecians, involves about 200 years of the most incredibly interesting history of Greece and the Grecian wars against Persia. But suffice it to say, this is what would happen. The Persians under Xerxes would invade Greece and burn the city of Athens. It was the cultural and educational centre of the Greek kingdom. They burnt it to the ground. They burnt the temples. That achieved something that 300 or 400 years of Greek history had failed to do. And that was to unite the warring Greek states into one army. Before that, the Greeks had always been at each other's throats. The Macedonians didn't like the Spartans, and the Spartans hated the Athenians, and every part of Greece, the Olympians and everyone else, everyone was always warring with each other. In fact, when Xerxes first invaded and landed his troops at a place called Marathon, the Athenians, who were just down the road from Marathon, sent a runner from Marathon to Sparta to get the Spartans to come to help them. And that man's name was Phidippides, and he ran 200 miles over rough terrain over mountains, through rivers, to get to Sparta, to plead with them to come, because the Persians had landed at Marathon. And the Spartans said, "We'll come at the next new moon," which was about 30 days away, which of course was going to be too late. So Phidippides ran all the way back again, fought in the Battle of Marathon, which the Greeks won against incredible odds because of weather that God sent. And Phidippides then was given the job of running to Athens to say, "Behold, we conquer," which was 26 miles from the Battle of Marathon. And having run 400 miles to get to Sparta and back again, fought in the battle, he'd run another 26 miles to good news to Athens that they had won the battle. He said, "Behold, we conquer," and collapsed and died. Which is why we have the marathon as the prime event of the Olympic Games. It's commemorating the run of Phidippides, "Behold, we conquer." A bit of history, but just like I love Greek history, so sorry about that. But anyway, what they did was the Persians, when they came the next time, after that first loss at Marathon, they burnt the city of Athens. And that then united the Greeks. The Greeks everywhere decided that they had enough of these upstart Persians, and even the Spartans then joined in the battle, which had never happened before. But the burning of Athens was to ignite a fuse that was to take place about 100 years later. And that was the rise of Alexander the Great. Why did Alexander march eastward? Well, he wanted to avenge the Greeks because of what the Persians had done in their invasions and the burning of Athens. You may be aware that Alexander had a policy that when he conquered different nations, if they submitted, he would let them live under their own rulers, providing they gave allegiance to him. He was a great mixture of violent and cruel, bloodthirsty vindictiveness sometimes, other times very gracious. And the Bible calls him that, the capricious nature of Alexander, described in Zechariah 9. But this mighty king would rise up. And it says in Daniel 11 verse 3, "And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." And that's Alexander the Great. And he had the Greeks united behind him to avenge what Persia had done. Every Persian city that Alexander conquered was left intact except one, the city of Persepolis. And that was the cultural, architectural, artistic centre, the holiday town of the Persian Empire. And he let his troops loose in one of the most violent, incredible pillages of any city Alexander ever conquered was done at Persepolis, in revenge for what they did to Athens. And you can see how the angel can see all of this. A mighty king shall stand up and shall do according to his will. And of course, you know, in 10 years, Alexander conquered territory the size of Australia or America, on horseback or on foot. He shall do according to his will, and the whole world was under the heel of Alexander. But he didn't last. Look what verse 4 says. "And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven." And you know what happened. As soon as Alexander's kingdom was at its peak, he died in Babylon at the age of 33. And the kingdom was divided amongst his four generals. The first thing the generals did was to eliminate Alexander's children. That's why it says, "not for his posterity." They killed all of Alexander's sons. It's the first thing the four generals did. And then they carved up the empire amongst themselves. Only two of those four divisions of Alexander's empire matters. Some of them were over in Greece, and that's not of importance in this prophecy, because this prophecy concerns nations that impact directly upon Israel. The two that inherited were the Seleucids, who inhabited the north of Syria and the bottom of Turkey, and the Ptolemies, who went down into Egypt. And they were two of Alexander's generals who became the kings of the north and the south, warring against each other and trampling on Israel in the middle. And Israel became the battleground for these two kings. And that's why we have this intrigue between the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And that takes up all of verse 5 to verse 29. What is fascinating about that is the preciseness and the sequence of events between the kings of the north and the battles that would take place and the intrigues that would take place. And every line of verse 5 to verse 29 can be traced to a historical event that is not questioned. You know, amazingly, even the greatest skeptics of the Bible have to say they cannot comprehend the accuracy of Daniel chapter 11 in describing the wars of the Greeks. It's an amazing prophecy. And then we come down in verse 30 to 35 and we have the rise of the Maccabees, who were the Jewish family, the Maccabeans, who resisted the Greeks, trampling over their territory. And when the Greeks set up the first abomination, when the Greeks actually sacrificed a pig in their temple in Jerusalem, the Maccabees had had enough. And they started a guerrilla campaign against the control of the Greeks. And Judas Maccabeus, the hammer, his name means, stood up and he received divine help to fight against the Maccabees. Just have a look, to fight with the Maccabees against the Greeks. Have a look what it says in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 34. Now, when they shall fall, and they did have many defeats, they shall be holpen with a little help. But many shall cleave to them with flattery. So there were a lot of people that joined Judas Maccabeus who had other agendas. But you see, they were hoping with a little help. And the angels were permitted to actually let the Maccabeans have some victories over the Greeks. And there are some remarkable things that happened in those Maccabean battles, where things happened that should never have happened. And that's another story. But what I want to get you to take away from this is that the history of Daniel 11 is a precise prediction of the wars between the king of the north and the king of the south, trampling over the land of Israel as they go. What I want to do is to come down to verse 30. And we have there the arrival of Rome on the scene in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Now, Rome began to look eastward about 300 BC. While the Greeks and the Persians were having a lovely time building each other to death, the Romans were growing in strength. Their empire was getting organised. And they were setting up the great Roman legions that would, within 300 years, conquer the whole of the known world. The Romans decided to toss in their lot with the Ptolemies in Egypt, that they might get a foothold in the east, and to oppose Antiochus, who was, of course, the ruler of the Seleucid kingdom. So, over a period of about 60 years, different Caesars made alliances with the Ptolemaic rulers in Egypt. And this is in the period 221 to 165. Finally, when the Ptolemies were about to be defeated by the Seleucids, the Romans stepped in. And they sent troops into Egypt. They sent the legions of Rome to Egypt. And it's recorded for us in verse 30, "For the ships of Chittim shall come against him." Now, you'll notice the him is very much part of chapter 11, because the him is usually the king of the north. Just remember that. Changes nations, changes personalities, but it's the king of the north. Alright? The ships of Chittim shall come against him. So a new power arrives to combat the king of the north. Therefore shall he be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. Let me explain to you what happened. This is one of the most remarkable things. We'll come back to the rest of that in a moment. This is a fascinating thing. So the legions come into Egypt, borne by the ships of Chittim. They were the ships of the Cypriots and the Phoenicians, who shipped the Roman legions across from Rome and from the Grecian peninsula into Egypt. So when Antiochus arrives with all his troops, thinking he's going to have an easy victory to wipe out the Ptolemies once and for all, after years and years of fighting, he finds the Roman legions have landed in Egypt. Now bear in mind, in these days there were no satellites, there were no news broadcasts. He didn't know the Romans were there. So he gets to the border of Egypt, and Polybius, the Roman consul, meets him. And you may have heard the phrase I don't know if South Africans use this vernacular, but there's a phrase which we use in Australia calling a line in the sand. Well, this is where it comes from. Drawn a line in the sand. What Polybius did was, as Antiochus came to meet him, Antiochus wanted, of course, to say to the Romans, "Look, we're just here to wipe out the Ptolemies. Please stand aside and let us go past." And the Roman consul, he said, no, you stand right there. And he got his stick and he drew a line, a circle around Antiochus. He said, right, we're here to support the Ptolemies. You have to decide whether you want to fight Rome as well as the Egyptians. Don't move out of that circle until you make up your mind. And that's the phrase, a line in the sand. Have you heard that phrase? That's where it comes from. And here's Antiochus in his great glorious procession before his troops, going to a certain victory, now being humiliated by the Romans. And that's why it says, therefore he shall be grieved, because the ships of Chittim have arrived. And I'm just giving this one example of how precise the angel can see this happening. He can see that happening. So what does Antiochus do? Well, he knows he can't defeat the Romans, so he's got to turn around and go home. And he's angry and he's humiliated in front of his men. So what does a man do when he's being told off by the boss at work? He goes home and kicks the dog, doesn't he? And that's exactly what Antiochus did. He went back to the land of Israel and he said, well, I can't defeat the Ptolemies, I can't defeat the Romans, but I can sure beat up these Jews. And it says, he had indignation against the Holy Covenant, so shall he do. And he then divided the Jews into two groups, isolated the Maccabees and got some of the Jews to go on his side. And in verse 21, he shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, take away the daily sacrifice, and place the abomination. And he took away the Jewish symbols of worship and crucified a pig in the temple, because he was upset that the Romans had spoiled his plans and humiliated him in front of his men. And this was his way of showing his men he was still in charge, is to go and beat up the Jewish religion. And it just gives you an idea, don't you, of the wars of the Maccabees. And that's why God said, when the Maccabees, the Jews, decide to revolt against the Greeks, I will help them a little help. I want to see these Greeks punished. And Judas Maccabeus had some remarkable victories. Anyway, let's leave that just to show you how this prophecy is so beautifully interwoven with history. He shall be grieved and shall return. And of course, that's the line in the sand. Now, I want to just deal with verse 36 to verse 39, because this is another king of the north now that comes along. After the Greeks, we have a new king of the north rises up, and this transition happens seamlessly. God's not concerned whether it's Greeks, Romans, Russians, doesn't matter. The person occupying the north of Israel is the king of the north. Remember, the territory is what matters. What I want to do is to show you the consistency of Daniel's prophecy. Now just come back to Daniel chapter 7, because the Roman power in Daniel is described in 3 or 4 different chapters, and very similar things are said about it. Now in Daniel chapter 7 we have the little horn of the fourth beast. Remember, there were 3 beasts that rose up. You know, the bear and the leopard and the lion, and then the terrible fourth beast, and had 10 horns, and 3 were plucked up. And in their place, a little horn came up speaking great things. And the little horn's got eyes. So the focus of Daniel's question and the explanation is about this little horn. Now we know that the 4 beasts parallel Daniel's image, but it's about the 4th horn that we now get the detail. So it's the latter phase in Daniel 7 of the terrible 4th Roman beast. It's the last power of the Roman Empire to emerge. Told that in verse 8. After this, 3 horns plucked up and the power finally comes. It places 3 horns. And of course, the papacy came into being by getting rid of 3 Roman kingdoms. The Exarchate of Ravenna and the other places. But, in the north of Italy, there were 3 Roman empires. They were taken over by the Roman armies and given to the Pope. So 3 horns were plucked up and those kingdoms were taken under control of the Pope. This little horn would have the eyes of a man. Its eyes were everywhere, seeing everything. Universal influence. And of course, through the means of the confessional, their eyes are everywhere. They know everybody's business. They can control people. They have their agencies, such as the Jesuits, in every place, looking after Catholic interests, harassing people who don't support the church's interests. The eyes of a man. A mouth speaking great things from verse 8, and an arrogant look from verse 20. Speaks great blasphemy in verse 25. Persecutes the saints for 1260 years in verse 25. And it lasts until destroyed by Christ in verse 11 and verse 26. So Daniel chapter 7 is quite clear about the nature of the horn power, which of course is the development of the Roman Catholic papal system. When you come to Daniel chapter 8, and that's in verse 23 to 25 of Daniel chapter 8, we have the Roman power in the east. And we notice, don't we, the consistency of how God views this little power that emerges in the east. And we now have another little horn, another power coming up. Where does it come from? We know Daniel chapter 8 is about the conflict between Persia and Greece. The Persian ram, battered by the goat that comes from the west, which of course was Alexander. The notable horn broken off. Alexander dies. 4 horns come up in its place. That's the 4 generals. But out of them, another little horn comes up and grows and grows and grows. And it's that 5th horn of Daniel chapter 8 that God's concerned with, because this is the Roman power in the east. So, this Roman power in the east has taken its foothold. Let's just go back to what we saw there. In BC 133, Pergamos, as we know it in Revelation, was bequeathed by the ruler of that city to Rome. He wanted to curry favour from the Romans, and so he left in his will that his kingdom of Pergamum would be given to the control of the Roman Empire. It became a Roman colony. It became a base for Rome in the east. It was the first city they owned in the east. In Revelation, Jesus calls it Satan's seat. He says, you live in Pergamos, Satan's seat. It was the place where the great enemy of God got a foothold in the east and became the king of the north. Between 63 and 67, Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony conquered the Greek territory, including Jerusalem and Israel. So the Romans now took over the land of Israel, but they had their base in the north, in Pergamum. So, back to Daniel chapter 8, this is the little horn that comes out of the 4 horns that succeeded Alexander. This is what it does. It casts down the truth to the ground. Now the truth is 2 things. The truth is Israel, God's people, and the truth are the saints, God's people. And Rome was to cast both of them to the ground. Destroyed the children of Israel and persecuted the saints. This power that would come into the east, in Pergamum, would be a power that understands dark sentences. It would have mysteries and rituals. You know, in Revelation it says, Babylon, Babylon, mystery was written upon her forehead. It's always been the realm of the Roman Catholic Church to talk about mysteries and rituals that only they understand. He is mighty but uses the power of others. Well, the Pope has been a wonderfully influential person down through the centuries of history. Very rarely had his own armies. Always co-opted the armies of Europe to do his bidding, particularly the armies of France and Spain. He destroys wonderfully many, especially the Jews, and they've done that. He promotes craft or falsehood, as the word means. He magnifies himself in his heart. He destroys many by using prosperity to corrupt them. I'm going to talk a bit in a moment about the power of papal finances. He opposes Christ and is finally destroyed. And that's Daniel chapter 8. And we come to Daniel chapter 11. Let's look at Daniel 11 verse 36 to 39. Now, as translation goes, there's probably few more difficult passages in the Bible and few more poorly translated passages in the Bible than Daniel 11 verse 36 to 39. But remember, we're talking about the latest king of the north. This is the Roman power. They started in Egypt. They eventually took over the whole territory of the Grecian Empire and became the king of the north in relation to Israel. And then it says in verse 36, the king shall do according to his will. So he's willful and does what he chooses. Well, Rome certainly did that, and especially the church does that. He exalts himself and magnifies himself above every god. And what happened, of course, is that the Roman Caesars, starting from Julius Caesar down through Augustus and then everyone that followed, formed the doctrine and perpetuated it that they, Caesars, were actually gods. When the papacy came along, they thought that concept was wonderful, and they actually made it a law of the world that they were God on earth. But it started with the Roman Caesars. So here's a force that now comes into the king of the north position, who exalts himself above every god. And of course that is clearly reflected in 2 Thessalonians. He speaks arrogantly against the God of gods. Look what it says there. He shall speak marvellous things against the God of gods, which of course is the God of heaven, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. It will last until the time of the end, which is exactly consistent with Daniel 7 and Daniel chapter 8. It goes on to say, in verse 37, he shall not regard the God of his fathers. What does that mean? Well, the Romans were pagans until 312. The first great earthquake in human thinking took place when Constantine, the emperor of Rome, decided to make his whole empire Christianized. And so Rome went from paganism, the god of their fathers, to a new god, the Christian gods. They will introduce celibacy. He shall not regard the desire of women. And that is something pretty well unique to the Roman Catholic Church doctrine. He will magnify himself above all. And of course that's exactly what the Roman papal system has done. He honours patron saints, the guardians you get there. Now, verse 38, but in his estate shall honour the force of, or the God of forces. And you'll see you have in your margin in the AV, protectors or guardians. This particular passage of the Daniel is really quite tricky. Let me just read it to you from Young's literal translation. This is verse 38. And to the God of strongholds on his station he shall give honour, to be a God which his fathers knew not, nor gave honour, with gold and silver and precious stones and with desirable things. And when he hath dealt in the fortresses of the strongholds, and you can see the translators are really struggling with this idea of buildings, these strongholds, and with these guardians of strongholds. Well, they didn't have to look far in 1611 to actually get that right. The guardians are the patron saints of the Roman Catholic Church. The prophecy in Timothy was, I'll just find it, Paul's prediction. In Timothy, the Spirit speaks expressly, says in the latter times some will depart from the faith, so after the time of Paul, devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teaching of demons, through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods. And this deceitful spirits is the guardian saints of the church. And they have guardian saints for all these things. So back where we were, they will honour patron saints or guardians. You know, Catholics pray to the saints. Who knows what the saint of travellers is? St. Nicholas, right? He's the patron saint of travellers. When you go to the Philippines and you get into a jeepney, which is one of the most horrifyingly frightening experiences you can experience on the earth, they have on their windows, St. Nicholas protect us. Some just have God help us. But it's usually St. Nicholas protect us. And they'll have a little image to St. Nicholas hanging off the mirror in these jeepneys because they certainly need it in Manila. But, you know, they have these patron saints. You know, St. Patrick is the patron saint of animals. And every saint has a particular role that they have, that look after people. He divides God's holy land for gain. In the days of the Crusades, which were organised at the instigation of Pope Urban, the successful French and English knights that went across there and took parts of the land were given great slices of God's land by the church as their reward for fighting for God's holy land. The church still owns in Israel enormous quantities of land that have survived down through the Turkish and Israeli occupations. In fact, one of the reasons for Armageddon that will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all nations will be the battle for the sacred sites that all the churches think they own in Jerusalem. They have divided God's land for gain. And then we have this fabulous wealth with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds. And again we have these strongholds or great castles for guardian saints. Now what are they? Well, a fabulously rich church that builds fabulously decorated cathedrals. So there's the prediction of Daniel 11 verse 36 to verse 39. And I've not gone into all the depth of the problems you can go into there, but the God of the forces is the God of guardians, the saints. The fortresses of strongholds, as Brother Thomas calls them, the Mahuzim bazaars, are the marketplaces of the church that are named after the saints. And the Roman Catholic Church is a marketing expert. So how has this come to pass? How has this particular king of the north, who came to be the power occupier in Constantinople, come into being? Look at what happened. There was, in 312, the conversion of Constantine to Christianity. The Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine, fighting for the control of Rome, claimed he saw a vision in the sky and a sign which said, "In this sign conquer." So a cross with the words in Latin IHS over it, which is "in this sign conquer." And so Constantine, having won the battle, got control of the Roman Empire, decided that we needed to become Christians. So he decided now it was better to go with the tide, because the Christian movement was growing, but it was a new way to assert himself. That's what Revelation 12 was all about. So there is Constantine now in charge. Paganism was overthrown, the first great earthquake of humanity. The whole empire was forced to convert or be wiped out, and many were wiped out by Constantine's victories. And they very cunningly decided that the best way to convert the pagans was to just change the names of their festivals. So the Feast of Saturnalia became Christmas. So you could keep it on the same day, December the 25th. You could have all the same rituals. You just now did it to Jesus instead of to Saturn. And so they just changed the names of the pagan festivals to call them Christian festivals. And that was very clever, but it was different to the old way. The New Testament saw this coming, that they would exalt themselves. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. There shall come a falling away first, says the Apostle Paul, an apostasy, the Greek word is, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, the one who's doomed for destruction, who opposes and exalted himself above all that is called God. And that's a direct quotation from Daniel 11 verse 36. All that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And it's a very clear prediction of the rise of the papacy. Sitting in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. You know, when a new pope is elected, the cardinals all get on their faces and worship him as God. Any new cardinal or priest that goes to Rome to be inducted by the Pope crawls towards the Pope on his face. And he sits there in St. Peter's, that they call the temple of God, saying, "Who can I be but God? Because I have the power of God, I am the voice of God on the earth." And they dress up in robes with great ceremony. Millions of tourists go to Rome to see them, and they sit there in the temple of God. You know, this is the Pope claiming to be God on earth. Old Rome had a saying which said, "Whom Rome creates, she adores." And they certainly do. Paul predicted the celibacy and the abstinence from meats. I don't know what it's like in your country, but up until perhaps the 70s, you could hardly get a meat in any restaurant because they always serve fish on Fridays. All cafeterias serve fish on Fridays because the Catholics banned eating of red meat on Fridays. And that's something the church has done for many, many years. Guardian angels and saints. As we said, there's any number of them. St. Nicholas, St. Patrick, St. Ursula, St. Joan, etc., etc., etc. And of course, the leading one they pray to is Mary. Having made Mary the mother of God, They worship her above all the other saints, and they pray to Mary for deliverance almost before they pray to God. And so we have this idea of guardian angels and saints that they worship. How was the apostasy unfolded? They combined Christian festivals with pagan festivals. They adopted Greek concepts of the afterlife. Where did the doctrine of hell come from? Where did the doctrine of purgatory and limbo come from? Well, it came from the doctrines that the Greeks had of the afterlife and the underworld, where there were different ways that you could work your way upwards towards the Elysian fields, which of course was the equivalent of heaven. As you went down there and you were tortured and persecuted in the underworld, and you gradually worked your way up to get out of the place. So the Romans have limbo and purgatory. Now, they've just dropped limbo after all these centuries, said it probably doesn't exist. But they've still got purgatory. And of course, purgatory is where you will suffer for a time, depending on whether you were good or bad, but you'll still suffer. But the length of time you suffer in purgatory will be decided by God before you go to heaven. So every Catholic has the fear of purgatory ahead of them. They ordained the guardian saints. They developed the doctrine of the Trinity. They exalted Mary as the Mother of God. They proclaimed the Pope as a universal bishop. They made the Pope's decrees infallible in 1870, introduced celibacy and abstaining from meat, persecuted all non-Catholics violently, and accumulated great wealth and property. And they've done all of those things. Let's just look at some of those. The persecuting of all non-Catholics. The history of the Inquisition and the Jesuits is one of the most terrible chapters on the face of human history. We look at Adolf Hitler and we say what a terrible man Hitler was. He burnt 6 million Jews. We look at Stalin and we say he starved to death and murdered 20 million of his own countrymen to finish the revolution. Do you know how many the historians estimate died because of Roman Catholic persecutions against heretics and against non-Catholic nations in religious wars? Well, the estimate is 68 million. That the Catholics either killed in war for religion or put to death by burning and the torture of the Inquisition. Over the centuries, estimated 68 million. You see why God hates that system? Money making. The markets, the idea, the mahuzim bazaars is the word that the Hebrew use. The selling of things. We don't see it much in our countries because the churches here have learnt that it doesn't quite work. But you go to the Philippines and you walk up to a Roman Catholic church and you look like you've gone through the local market to get to the door. Traders have been licensed by the church to line the avenues around their churches to sell their wares, which are usually church icons and little religious symbols and all of those things the church wants to sell, and the church gets a cut. So where they can, they sell things in their saints and their fortresses of guardians. They have the sale of relics. They have the displays of relics. They sent to Australia recently the relics of the Roman Catholic Church. It cost a fortune to go and see them. And you can go and see the feather of an angel and the finger of the Holy Spirit and enough wood from the cross to make the ark. But they've got all the relics of the church and all the bones of the saints they brought out that you could go and pay to see. In South America, up until very recently, they ran lotteries for the souls of the dead. So the populace would buy tickets in a lottery and the winner would actually rescue their relative from purgatory. So the church made an enormous killing. It didn't cost them a cent for the prize. But they'd send millions and millions of these tickets and one person would get out of purgatory that won the lottery. Great money-making system. Charging for prayers and masses. The church has a schedule of fees. When somebody dies, you have the monthly mass and the mind mass, and it costs you every time. Papal endorsements. Do you realise that when the Pope travels, the Roman Catholic Church legal system completely frustrates anybody who tries to sell anything that the papacy hasn't authorised? Tremendous legal force goes into being when the Pope goes to another country, and if you want to sell something that relates to the Pope's visit, you've got to pay the church to do so. It's called the Papal Marketing Commission. When the Pope went to California a few years ago, this is Pope Paul II, a gardening company who sold water sprinklers got a papal endorsement for the Pope's visit and advertised under the theme, "Let us spray." And the Pope, or the Papal Marketing Organisation, organised and endorsed that they had the licence to go, "Let us spray." You think this is funny? This is exactly what God could see. Well, you probably heard about the sale of indulgences. What started the Protestant movement was the sale of indulgences. In about 1500 or 1600, somewhere around there, the Pope was broke. The Vatican needed enormous repairs. He'd spent all his money on wars, so he had to raise some money. He sent a man called Tetzel out from Rome through Europe to sell indulgences. Now, indulgences are not a licence to go and commit sin, as sometimes is thought. An indulgence was a relief from the years in purgatory. So there were different levels of indulgences. You might get so many, you might buy a 10-year relief from purgatory, or a 5-year release from purgatory, or a 2-year release from purgatory, depending how much you paid. The church also devised a system that the richer you were, the more you paid. But they had it all worked out, and Tetzel went around selling this relief from purgatory indulgence, signed by the Pope, that guaranteed that if you bought this for your relative, that they would spend less time in purgatory, accompanied by preaching of how bad purgatory really was. So people flocked to sell their houses, sell their stock, to put their last savings into buying these worthless bits of paper that were being sold all over Europe for their relatives to spend less time in purgatory, or for themselves, for that matter, to spend less time in purgatory. Didn't cost the Pope any more than a few signatures. And they raised a fortune doing it. Eventually, Martin Luther was so disgusted by this that he took on the church and created the Protestant movement. But they had a field day selling indulgences. And you get some idea of why God says, through gold and silver and precious stones he shall corrupt many. And this is a system that God absolutely hates because of this commercialism. This was a heading in a recent magazine, "The Bank That Can Save the World." With all the trouble the European banks are in, the richest, most profitable organisation in the world, the greatest property holding organisation in the world, is the Vatican. You think, just in your city here, how much land they own, how many schools they own, how many churches they own, how many missions they own. You go through Europe and they own about half the cities of Europe. In Adelaide, there are enormous tracts of hugely profitable land in the centre of the city owned by the Catholic Church. And that's the same in every city in the world. The Vatican could solve Europe's problems just by giving them a few loans. And that might happen. The silver and gold that they've accumulated is amazing. The world's richest institution, but also a very corrupt financial institution. If you haven't read it, do yourself a favour, read a book called In God's Name, which details the history of the Vatican Bank mixed up with the Masons and the Mafia in Italy, and the scandals of the Vatican Bank. Why did we have 3 popes in 1 year? Why was Pope John Paul I's body never, ever seen by anybody except the papal physicians? Well, he was going to take on the Vatican Bank. He lasted 1 month in office. His promise was he was going to sort out the Vatican Bank. Well, they got him before he got there. Just another funny story. You can go to the city of Brisbane in Australia, capital of Queensland, drive into the city, and there's a great big hole in the middle of Brisbane. It's been there for years, since 1961. A massive hole in the ground. An undeveloped building site. And you say, what's that? Well, 1961, they collected enough money to build the Brisbane Cathedral of the Catholic Church, dug the hole, and then sent the money to Rome for the Pope to bless it. They are still waiting. That's why the Bible talks about the fortresses of guardians. These massive structures, the cathedrals of Europe and all over the world. Fantastic buildings, full of riches and gold and jewels. Every one of them dedicated to a saint. Everyone called after a saint. The fortresses of the guardian saints. And there they are. And the Bible is quite accurate, isn't it? Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 11, exactly what God said would happen has happened. Amazing buildings, all of them on prime real estate. Well, what's the fate of this king of the north, this new power that arrived in the east? We're told that God will destroy it. He will destroy it with the brightness of his coming. In Daniel 7, until thrones were cast down and a fiery stream issued and came forth. And I beheld them because of the great words which the horn spake. And I beheld until the beast was slain and the body destroyed and given to the burning flame. He shall be broken without hand, says Daniel chapter 8. In Revelation, great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. And the kings of the earth who committed fornication, who lived deliciously with her, shall bewail her and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, saying, Alas, alas! And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise any more. You think of how many people in the world are made rich by the church. And so we come to the time of the end. Time of the dead. Armageddon, and the time of troubles as never was, which is the subject for tomorrow. What do we take away from Daniel chapter 11? Well, as we said, from verse 40 onwards, there's a jump between verse 39 and verse 40 of about 1,500 years. The angel can see that Daniel's eyes are just glazing over. You know, he's all this prophecy of the Greeks, and now the arrival of Rome and the development of the papal system, and Daniel's going, like that. The angel just says, well, okay, Daniel, let's go right to the end. Jump 1,500 years ahead. But Daniel, one day the time will come. And verse 40 starts with the words, and at the time of the end. Daniel chapter 12 starts, at that time. Daniel, the time will come. Daniel 7, the time came that the saints of the Most High possess the kingdom. Psalm 102, they shall arise and have mercy on Zion, for the time to favour her, the set time is come. The divine timetable that Gabriel and Michael organised has an end. Daniel, the end will come. And at that time, Daniel, thy people, both Jews and the saints, will be delivered. And you see, there's the promise that one day it will come. What do we take away from Daniel chapter 11? Well, let's just take away these lessons, brethren and sisters, for ourselves. Daniel was overwhelmed to see that the warfare was long, that the treading down of his people would go on for century after century, that the saints would be persecuted by this power that arose in the east. And Daniel was exhausted by looking so far ahead. But we are standing in the middle of verse 40. You know, the king of the south has pushed at the king of the north in 1917, when Britain, the new king of the south, pushed the Turks out. And we are waiting for the king of the north, another king of the north, to come and invade Israel. So, we don't have to look back. We've got to look forward. We've got 2,500 years of fulfilled history, precisely fulfilled history, that we can look back on to say everything that God wrote there came to pass. 64 specific prophecies in Daniel chapter 11 have come to pass. And you can find a specific historical event that completely fulfills the terms of Daniel chapter 11. Bible critics can't explain Daniel chapter 11. Should we have any less confidence that what says from the middle of verse 40 onwards will come to pass with exactly the same precision? Of course we have that confidence. We're assured that God is in control of all national events, that the river will go to the end of its course as God has determined, and that God's timeline is in operation. These are some words from Brother John Morris. It actually brings home the and he was the assistant editor of the Christadelphian, in case you don't know who he is. Words which actually are very powerful for us. We don't revel in the fact that we can explain all these things. It's about warning. God does tell his servants what is to come to pass, but he doesn't necessarily give them all the details. Sufficient only to keep them on the tiptoe of expectation. He also shows the disciple that prophecy is not just about prediction, it's about preparedness. We are not called upon to forecast precisely what will happen, but to be ready whenever it might happen. And as it unfolds, we can say, yes, that's what God said would happen. We mightn't know exactly what events the angels organise to fulfil their charter and make things happen at the time they should. But when they happen, we know we are getting closer all the time to the time of the end. Because the events of verse 40 onwards, when the King of the North comes like a whirlwind, brings in the time of the resurrection. And it may not be more than a few years in the whole process. So let's be ready, brethren and sisters. Pray always that you might be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man.